So we are in Ecclesiastes. Last week we talked about the introduction to the book. We just did a brief introduction. And I said because we've only got 4 weeks before summertime starts, and if we want to do a summer Bible study, we can decide to do that. But with our meals, I decided to pick Ecclesiastes because it is fairly short, it's succinct, and it's practical. And one of the things we can say about the book itself in terms of its authorship is that although Koheleth, the teacher in the Hebrew is Koheleth, in the prologue and other places says he's the son of David, was king in Jerusalem. By the end of the book, in the epilogue, all we have is that it is Koheleth was a man of knowledge, but even more, he taught the people the art of perception. And for much of the book, the idea is that the teacher is giving wisdom and observation about the world around us. And some of it has to do with our relationship with God, but some of it has to do with the very questions each of us have about life. So it's a very practical book. It doesn't talk a lot about the law, as much of the rest of the Old Testament does, in terms of the Ten Commandments, in terms of, how do you practice both the law as it concerns worship and neighbor. We do have some of that, but it isn't referencing like the other books. And last week we talked about, as we look at Ecclesiastes, I'm using a translation from Norbert Lofink, a German theologian who, in his translation, which was translated in English, goes back to the introduction or the prologue, and instead of vanity of vanities or meaningless of meaningless, in verse 2, he uses the Hebrew and translates it, a breath, a puff of breath, a breath, a puff of breath, Koheleth used to say. They are all a breath. What profit does one draw from all the possessions for which one labors under the sun? And that's kind of the thesis statement of the whole of the book. So the rest of it's going to ask some questions about if life is short, if life is but a puff of breath. And we talked about, in the scheme of things, one breath is equal to a lifetime in the history of the world. Our lives are very short in comparison to everything else. And in the shortness of the breath of the life, what does it profit a person to try to get as much as they can? And we started, as we looked at the cosmology that he starts with in verse 4 through verse 11, he describes a universe, a world, as a generation passes, another comes, and the earth stays the same, or stays in eternity. And he describes a universe, a world in which God has made that it seems to just kind of go back and forth. The rivers flow to the sea, and where do they end up? Back in the river, going back to the sea. It just kind of goes back and forth. The wind blows, and it comes back around. The sun rises, it comes back around. And what he's saying is, in our short amount of time, it's hard for us to see all of the cyclical things that happen in God's creation. He says, whatever has occurred will occur again. Whatever has been carried out will be carried out again. There is nothing new under the sun. So he begins with this cosmology of saying that, we are just but a breath in the larger scheme of things. And every generation comes along and thinks that what they experience, what they see is new. When you were a teenager, you thought, I'm having these feelings. I'm listening to this music. I'm rebelling against my parents because they don't understand. Well, they did that too. And the ones before that did that. And the ones before that did that. And it's, the things we talk about, when countries go to war, we feel like in our generation, it's new. Nobody's ever experienced what we experience. And Koheleth is saying that all of these things have happened before, and they'll happen again. He even gives us in some of the earlier parts of it is that, one generation comes, another generation goes, and by the end, who will remember you? He gives an even playing field as you go through chapter 2 of, whether you are the wise or the fool, everybody's end is the same. So he's making kind of observations about life is that everybody dies. And whether they've got everything or nothing, whether they are the king, he'll use the king because the king in Israel's tradition is always thought to be the person that was supposed to be the most wise. But most of the time in Israel's history they weren't. Or the fool. And the fool is often in Ecclesiastes, oftentimes attributed to those that have nothing, the poor. Whether you are the rich, wise, or the poor fool, Koheles says, is that everybody ends up in the same place, death. So he says, what good is all of our knowledge, what good is all of our pursuit of wealth and possessions if we all what? End up in the same place. This practical knowledge, and we might if we had to sit down with Koheles, we might say, you're kind of a glass half empty kind of guy, aren't you? Some days I feel a lot like Koheles. I think most of us do. At the end of our time last week, we ended with, there are the ones whom he has commanded to be involved in the business of increasing and collecting, and then of giving it to all the one who is blessed in the eyes of God. This too is a breath, an inspiration and air. And I'm using Lofink. I know it's going to be different than most of y'all's translations, and we can go back to y'all's as we go. Chapter 3 begins with a very poetic description of the cyclical cycle of life. So we've seen the cyclical cycle of the cosmology of the world around us, but now he kind of centers in on life. And he begins with the idea everything has its hour, every interest under the heavens, there is an appointed time. So for Koheles, everything that happens is set just like the rising of the sun or the setting of the sun. And everything that we think is new happens in somewhat universal ways to everybody. He says, a time to give birth and a time to die. And for us, we have to understand that all of life is lived in those two extremes. I want you to think about, you come into the world, you take what? A breath. You leave the world by what? Taking the last one. So the idea is life is what? A puff, a puff, a puff of breath. In that short amount of time that each of us live, he says there's a time to plant and a time to harvest the plants. So he's using common stock imagery of anybody within Israel. They knew there are times that you planted and the times that you harvested. The planting times were the times that you what? You put a lot of work in. The harvest you put a lot of work in. The in-between of those things is when things grew. You celebrated harvest. There's a time to kill and a time to heal. As we'll talk about in a minute, he's living in the ancient world where there are times what? You go to war. Now he's not, saying that we should go kill anybody, but there are seasons in life where things what? Get messy. And then there are seasons in life what? Where there's restoration. He uses extremes to let us know that life's lived kind of in between of the extremes. Most of us don't live always in a killing season or always in a healing season. There's a time to tear down and a time to build. You know, the former generation built the house. It's been there a long time. Former generation built the wall in the garden. It's fallen apart. It's time to tear it down and what? Build a new one. But most of us live in the in-between times. There's a time to cry and time to laugh. The double is there, a time to lament and a time to dance. Most of us live in between those. But life is an up and down. I always remind myself when things are good, enjoy them, because what's going to happen? Something's going to happen. There's always going to be that next something. It may happen to me. It may happen to somebody I love. It may happen in the larger world. I mean, you know, pre-COVID, none of us would have thought that the world would shut down for 2 years. Or we probably would have gone on more vacation and enjoyed stuff. You know, I remember in high school going out of the country, and then that fall, 9/11 happened. And I thought, you know, that was the last time I remember ever going out of the country and it being easy. You know, the airports were different. Everything was different after that. So there are ups and downs in life. There's a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. This is probably a euphemism. Throwing stones oftentimes in the Hebrew was a way of talking about procreation. A time to gather stones. And it's a double couplet probably there, a time to embrace and a time to stay at arm's length. A time to search and a time to give up for lost. A time to keep, a time to throw away, a time to tear, and a time to sow, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate. And the other double couplet with that is a time of war and a time of peace. When anyone takes action, what profit does he make from his labor? I now observe that the business in which humans are forced to be involved because of God's command, all that He has enacted perfectly in its time. Moreover, He has put eternity in all of it, but not in such a way that humans could find out the action which God has carried out from beginning to its end. So the reality is, even in this interest of life, from the moment we breathe our first to the moment we breathe our last, we know that we live in a very short amount of time. Now, Koheleth is coming from ancient Israel, that although he will talk vaguely about it, not until the intertestament period, until the New Testament period, do people really talk in the Jewish thought about what happens after you die. So Koheleth's not going to give us a whole lot of imagery of after you die. We as Christians, we come back beside this and say, you know, Koheleth's not talking about the new life and the resurrection that we know. So we would have some dialogue with Koheleth. But here he's saying, in this moment you're born to the moment you die, why is it we know that there is more than that? You know, this is part of, he says, moreover, He has put eternity in all of it, but not in such a way that humans could find out the action which God has carried out from its beginning to end. So what he's saying is humans have a limited view on what God is doing in all of this. There's still mystery involved in this big action that God has created, because we only get what? A little glimpse of the whole. And for Koheleth, that's not necessarily always a good thing, because it what? We ask questions about that. Why did this have to happen this way? Why does this happen this way? I perceived in all of there is no happiness in activities except so far as one can be joyful and in ways enact happiness during one's own lifetime. And what is more, when a person is able to eat and drink and taste happiness in all his possessions, that is always a gift of God. And I perceive that every action that God carries out occurs in eternity. To it nothing can be added and nothing taken away. And God has made humans to fear Him. Whatever is occurring now has already been there, and whatever is to be has already occurred, and God will search for whatever has been chased off. There is something else that I observed under the heaven. In the very place of justice, there is lawlessness. In the very place of law abiding, there is lawlessness. So he transitions from some of these questions about the human life and human existence in the larger scheme of things, now that he begins to offer some social critique about the world around him. Now, one of the things we'll have to talk about as we think about Koheleth, whether Koheleth is the king or whether he is giving us the option of thinking of him as someone like the king, he is speaking from somebody that's higher up in society. So it'd be interesting if Koheleth was saying these things to people on the bottom, how they would perceive it. Because a lot of times he'll talk about, what life is like with everything, and then when he talks about people that have nothing, he talks about it as though, he's never experienced it. And we would ask the question, well, what do you know of justice if you've never faced injustice? What do you know of hunger if you've never been what? Hungry. So that's a 21st century reading of the text that Koheleth's not concerned about. But I want us to understand when Koheleth is describing things, he's describing it from a place of privilege. And he's pretty upfront about that. But sometimes we miss that. So when he's talking about justice, he says, there is something else I observed under the seven. The very place of justice, there is lawlessness. So if we were to go back to ancient Israel, and more than likely Ecclesiastes, although attributed to Solomon, probably wasn't written until the post-exilic period. So after the people have been taken to Babylon, and after they've come back to Judea, and they're rebuilding the temple, and the temple starts back. And you've got Ezra and Nehemiah into that situation. This is probably, during a period where some of our last minor prophets existed. But even if you go earlier, what he's saying is the place that there is supposed to be justice. And the ideal place of justice in ancient Israel was the temple. It's where heaven and earth meet and God resides. And he says, the very place that justice is supposed to happen, there is lawlessness. I want us to think about that for a moment. If we were to put that into today's society, where is justice supposed to happen? Government, court, yeah. Do we see justice always happening where it's supposed to happen? No. I mean, let's just be honest. Who usually gets off?
The rich and affluent.
Affluent. People that have the best, lawyers? Powerful. I mean, and who usually ends up, not always, but those that can't get justice are usually the what? The ones that can't. So even in today, the place where justice is supposed to be blind, I mean, we often have images of justice being blind, doesn't necessarily always happen. And he's saying the very same thing thousands of years ago. There's nothing new under the sun. He says the very place of justice, there's lawlessness. The very place of law abiding, the temple, there's lawlessness. The very place that people are supposed to be the ideal version of who they are, oftentimes is the place where things get corrupted. So I thought to myself, it is God who judges both the law-abiding and the lawless. For every interest there is an appointed time, and for every action in that place. With regard to humans as individuals, I thought to myself, God has singled them out and or from this, they must recognize that in reality, they are, what does your verse 18 say for you? Let me look at a different translation. Where are we?
So they may see they are like the animals?
Like the animals. One single fate awaits both. As these die, so others, but they share the same air. There is no advantage for the human over the animal. Both are a breath. They both pass to one place. They both come alive out of the dust, and both return to the dust. Who perceives if the air of a human really goes upward, while the air of an animal descends down to the earth? So I have observed that there is no happiness except in for it, as one finds joy in one's activity. That is one's portion. Who can enable a person to taste something that will happen only afterward? So Koheles, probably not the best Baptist preacher. And Koheleth essentially says, in terms of God's creation, everything what? Everything is born, what? Dies. Whether you are the law-abiding citizen or the lawless person, whether you are the rich or the poor, whether you are the wise or the foolish, whether you are human or animal. And at the end of the day, you'll what? You'll be dust. We'd probably have a little more to say about that, but we're reading Koheles, so we'll let him speak for today. So I observe there is no happiness as far as one finds joy in one's activity. That is one's option. Who can enable a person to taste something that will happen only afterward? So he says, if you want to find enjoyment in life, you need to find joy in what you do. You know, we've talked about dogs. I look at my dogs. They got it cushy. I'm thinking, ain't too bad. Every day is pretty much the same for them. They love their day. The difference between me and them is I know when I wake up and when I go to bed that there's a finality to it. Dog doesn't know that. You know, part of the question Koheleth will bring up is if we didn't know these things, would we be happier? That might be true. We talked last week about children who can just fall asleep anywhere and get put in their bed. I mean, as an adult, you probably end up in jail. Or somebody's going to prank you, or something's going to happen. Steal your sandwich, that's right. So, you know, for us as adults, we know that things are complicated. They're hard. They're not easy. As children, we take it for granted that there's food on the table and clothes to wear and they're clean. Here, the reality is that at the end of the day, Koheleth is saying, the teacher is saying, that everything turns to dust, and for those that, if all they do is to think about what happens afterwards or count on that to find their enjoyment, well, then they've missed enjoying life as it comes. Again, I further observed all that is carried out under the sun in order to exploit people. So he looks and he's asking the question, you know, everything that's carried out under the sun, essentially during the day, from day to day, about those that are being taken advantage of. They're exploited. He says, just look. The exploited ones weep, and no one comforts them. From the hands of who exploits them comes violence, and no one comforts them. I always congratulate the dead who have already died, and do not the living who must still go on living. I would consider to be still happier that either the one who has not been as yet, and the one who has not observed the evil activity that is carried under the sun. So he looks at those that have been exploited, those that weep because of it, and those that have suffered because of violence. Now notice, he observes it, he's not experienced it. So it'd be like for us to talk about a third world country if we never lived there. You know, You go to a third world country and you realize, as bad as things are, many people there can find enjoyment in life. Kohelet can't imagine that. And he comes with the question, maybe it would have been better not to have been born at all. Now, we have an issue with this question, but this is an Old Testament question that comes up over and over again. The prophet Jeremiah essentially cannot say to God, God, I'm mad at you, I wish you, bad. But when Jeremiah is called to go out and preach and prophesy, what happens to him? He gets beat up, he gets put in prison. And there's a portion in Jeremiah where he is lamenting his call. And he essentially says, it would have been better for me if I'd have never been born. And the reality is sometimes life happens and somebody gets to a part in their life where they think, is this all that there is? Did I have to live through this much suffering? And for Kohelet looks at people that are being exploited and the people that are being exploited with violence. And we would ask some of those hard questions, for things we can't control or do. And if we live through those, would ask the question, would it have been better if I'd never been born? If all I had to do was suffer? And he says, and I observed that every labor and every successful action means rivalry between people. And this too is a breath and an inspiration of air. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better a handful with quiet than 2 handfuls with labor and an inspiration of air. So he looks at not only those being exploited, but he also looks at those that are being successful. And their success breeds what? Competition. And that rivalry breeds, you never get enough. So he looks at the people that are being exploited, and then he looks at the people that are exploiting. And neither one of them are satisfied in life, are they? No. One has nothing and weeps because of it. One has more than they need, but they keep competing to get what? More. We don't see that today, do we? And then he looks at the person the fool who folds his hands. The fool often equals the lazy or the person that's not willing to go out and work. And what does he say? He eats his own flesh. He cannibalizes himself. Better a handful with quiet than 2 handfuls with labor and an inspiration of air. He's not the most positive person. It's just, But we talked last week about, Kohelet is doing something most people in his time, in his day, don't have time to do. Most people are working. They go from sun up to sundown. They eat, they go to sleep, they get up and what? Work from sun up to sundown, go to sleep. That's their life. Kohelet's living a cushier enough life that he's able to what? Think about things. Worry about things. Most of us don't go around thinking and worrying about all of these things. I get tickled with, and I'll say this, and if you disagree with me, that's okay. We like disagreeing around here. We're a good church. We love people that have different opinions and thoughts. But I get tickled with people, that, especially Christians, that fight over, whether the earth was made in a literal 7 days or whether it was billions of years. Because I've never woke up in the morning and really worried that much about how it came to be. I'm interested in it, and my opinion might be different than somebody else's. But I don't wake up thinking about it or going to bed about it. Same with politics. People get so frustrated with politics. I might think about it for 10 minutes a day. I read the news and stuff, but I don't get up waking up about it and thinking about it. What do I wake up thinking about and going to bed thinking about? What matters most to me? And Kohelet doesn't have maybe that thing. So he's got time to think about things. I'll wake up thinking about my wife and my daughter and my family and my work and the church and God. Sandwich, that's in the middle of the day. See, I'm honest, I'm vulnerable to you guys. I'm not perfect. I get angry. Maybe if Koheleth was writing, he would put that in there.
Is it time to be angry? Is it?
Time to be angry, yeah.
Time to be hungry.
Yeah, time to be hungry. Again, verse 7, I further observed a breath under the sun. It happens that a person stands alone and there is no second. Yes, not even a son or a brother, but his possessions are limitless, and moreover, his eyes are not sated or made whole by wealth. But for whom am I laboring, and why deny my happiness? This too is a breath. It is a bad business. Two are better than one. If it happens, they are well rewarded by their possessions. For if they fall, the one can lift up his partner. Too bad for the one who falls with no second to help him. Moreover, when two sleep together, they warm one another. But how will one alone get warm? And if someone can overpower one person, still two will resist him. And a third ply cord will not be soon broken. But a poor young man who knows is better a poor man who knows than a king who is old but a fool, because he no longer perceived that he should take advice. He says, but think about a person who has everything, limitless possessions, but they're alone. We often think of, around Christmas time, Scrooge. He's got it all, but he doesn't have anybody to share him with. And if he gets sick, who's going to be there to take care of him? With his possessions? And then he talks about how it would be better for someone to have somebody than not have somebody. And this might be in both partnership in business, but also in life. You know, if somebody falls in a well or a pit, in their day, if you were trying to lay a trap for some sort of predator or prey, you would dig a pit and cover it up. And the imagination would be somebody would walk into it, just like in a cartoon, fall in it. Well, if two people are walking and one falls in, the other person can go get help. If nobody's there to help you, what happens? You sit there and die. The other in ancient Palestine, it might be hot during the day, but it gets cold at night. If you're stuck out by yourself somewhere without anything to warm you, another person's body heat keep you warm. Might mean what? Life or death. And the third, if somebody comes along and tries to overpower you, rob you, hurt you, it'd sure be good to have a buddy there to what?
Yeah.
There's, people that are all about possessions have lost kind of the ability to understand that life's meaning goes beyond that. What good is it to have everything if you don't have anybody to share it with? It sounds like a Twilight Zone episode. Wake up, you've got everything you ever wanted, but nobody to share it with. What good would it be to be an artist if nobody could see your art? What good would it be to be a musician if nobody could hear your music? What good would it be to write poetry if nobody heard it? And that's the same with life. We'll do just a bit more and we'll have to leave. The young man was freed from prison and became a king, even though he had come into the world destitute while the other already reigned. But I observed that all the living who walked under the sun sided with the next young man who arose in his place. The people carry on, whoever it is that leads them. Moreover, the most recent generation will not be full of joy about him either, for that too is a breath and a spirit of air. So he says, essentially, you could be the best king in the world, but when your time's up, somebody else is just going to fill your place. And as good as you are, somebody else will want somebody else to be in the position. The reality is, whatever you think is going to fulfill you might not be the thing that really does. And just because you've gotten on top doesn't mean people want you to stay there. The things we think are permanent in life, Koheleth is saying, is they're not. That's part of the illusion of life. And if you put all your chips or your stakes on that thing, possession, position, and it gets taken out from you, what do you have left? So part of what Koheleth is saying is don't invest everything in those things. Because just like that cycle of things, what comes goes. It's not permanent. Most of the things we think in life are permanent aren't permanent. They just appear to be permanent. Watch your step when you go into the house of God. Enter in order to listen, and not as the fool does, in order to deliver a sacrifice. They do not even perceive how to do evil. Do not be too fast with your mouth, and your heart don't burn to make a speech in the presence of God. God is in heaven, you are on the earth, so let your words be few. Dreams come with a multiplicity of busyness, and the voice of the fool with a multiplicity of words. When you make a vow to God, don't delay in carrying it out. God takes no interest in a fool. Whatever you vow, carry it out. It is better to vow nothing than to vow and not carry it out. Don't permit your mouth to bring your flesh down into sin. Never declare before the messenger, it was an oversight. Why should God rage about what you are saying and destroy the actions of your hands? Rather, when dreams multiply and puffs of breath and endless words, then fear God. So he gives just a little bit of religious critique in the end of 4, the beginning of 5. And part of this is when you go to worship, one of the things he tells his students, be careful what you say. You know, when we think about worship, Jesus gives a lot of good advice. Jesus will say, don't be like the hypocrites or the stage actors that go in and make a lot of promises to God. He says, they use a lot of words and, they swear on the temple, they swear on these things. Jesus says, in the Sermon on the Mount, let your yeses be your yeses and your noes be your noes. Make it simple. If you say you're going to do something, then do it. But have the intention before you say it. And what Koheleth is saying, a lot of times when people went to worship in the temple, they would often come making promises about what they would do. We know people. I had a cousin one time that was near death, got a little better, promised in the hospital he was going to quit smoking and quit being kind of a jerk and so forth. He got home. That lasted a couple weeks. It's easy to make the promise. It's hard to keep it. But in heaven, when we make promises to God, what he's saying, make sure you are careful what you say. Make sure you're careful with how you worship God so that you can carry out what you say, because it's one thing to be a fool in front of each other. But don't do it towards God. Because God sees the eternity of things, and we have a limited view. And sometimes our mouth can write checks we can't cash. And he's just making that towards people he knows and he's seen, and we see it too. Each and every day we see a lot of people say a lot of things. We might apply it both to the religious and the non-religious. Politicians do the same thing. You can go back into Roman history when the senators would and it was only the aristocrats that could be senators, they would make promises they knew good and well they couldn't keep, but it didn't keep them from making them. We do that sometimes too. And the problem is, it's easy to do it with us, but be careful how you do it to God, especially in an act of worship. Next week, we will continue Koheleth, and we'll try to move a little faster. He's going to continue some social critique. Then he's going to kind of deconstruct some things that he's thinking about kind of, going back to that orderly thing and realizing that some of the order that he sees, it's hard. And then he's going to talk towards the end about ethics of his day, and we can see some of the same things happening in our day. And by the end of it, he gives us in the epilogue, the person that kind of finishes off Koheleth's teachings, what good is all of this? To know everything that Koheleth knows. And for us, we know a lot more than Koheleth. You pull out your phone, and you know more about the world in 20 minutes than they could have known most of their life, in terms of what's happening on the other side of the world. And for us, we would say with more knowledge, with more understanding of the world around us, sometimes that becomes what? Overwhelming. And then the question comes, what do we do with it? I mean, like we talked last week, the more we know about the world, and the reality is we can't do anything about it, that gets frustrating. It's frustrating to know what's happening in Ukraine or Gaza and Israel, and know that, or Haiti, or even parts of the United States, and know, I can send money, I can pray, but I can't change anything. I mean, it's hard enough to know it about your family and feel like I can't change and do anything about this, and then put on the other on top of it. That's a lot for people. And Koheleth understands that he's unique in his day, but he's not today, because everybody has access to information and knowledge. And it becomes overwhelming. And what do you do with it? Can you enjoy life? And he's going to say there are people that can, and this is how they enjoy it. And for us, as followers of Jesus, we'll kind of end our sessions together talking about what do we do with Koheleth in the light of Christ. And some of what Koheleth we can take with us, especially on our grumpy days or our pessimistic days. But we should always spin it in the light of God's love and salvation and hope that we have in resurrection. For him, everything ends at death. We know that death isn't the end, and that there's victory over it, and that brings joy for us. But we still live in between those two things. And how are we going to live knowing some of the very things that Koheleth says? So, as I talked about, this is a more practical book in that it just talks about everyday life. When we do something like Leviticus, most of us aren't, waking up in the morning wondering if we've touched something impure and how we're going to cleanse ourselves, or, what's the proper way to sacrifice a bull. We don't have those kind of thoughts. Koheleth doesn't deal with those things. He deals with the everyday activity of human existence. And very existential. So, let me pray for us, and if y'all have any comments, questions, we can talk. And I know Kelly and them are probably ready for me to be done. So y'all can pick up children. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. God, we thank you for the opportunity that we have to be together, to reflect, to study. God, as we go about our week this week, there are going to be things in our lives that we can't control. And there are going to be things that happen around us that we see as unfair. Maybe they happen to us, maybe they happen to others. And in all of that, there is a temptation for each of us to become bitter, to become self-focused and only interested in what we can have and what we can do. Help us to resist those things. Help us to resist the anxiety and the worry that comes with life. And as we'll hear from Koheleth, let us just enjoy the meal that we have, the families that we have. And as Christ would tell us, let us know that our Heavenly Father loves us more than the birds of the air or the lilies of the field. And that although we have worries and cares that surround us, they don't have to be our masters. They don't have to control us. Lord, we give you our lives. And in the scheme of things, we know they're short. So let us use them abundantly. For your glory, we pray this in Christ's name. Amen.